The day Rebecca Hayes knocked on the door of the most silent man in all of Harlan County, Texas. The sky above was the color of a bruise healing purple and gold and still tender at the edges, the kind of sky that made a person feel small and brave at the same time. She had been riding for 3 days. Her horse, a speckled gray mare named Duchess, was bone-tired beneath her, and Rebecca herself was not much better. The year was 1882, and the land stretched in every direction like something God had laid out in a hurry and never quite come back to finish. The mesquite trees were twisted and stubborn. The red dirt road that cut through the valley had been barely a road at all for the last 15 miles, more suggestion than certainty, and Rebecca had followed it on faith and desperation in equal measure. She had a letter in her coat pocket. She had read it so many times the paper had softened to the texture of cloth. She kept it close, pressed against her ribs, as if the words inside it might keep her heart from collapsing entirely. The ranch came into view just as the sun touched the top of the western ridge, spilling long amber light across a low, wide house built from cedar and limestone, with a covered porch that ran the full length of the front. There was a barn behind it, red and sturdy, and a corral fence in good repair. There were chickens in the yard, which she took as a good sign, because chickens meant someone was still tending to things, even if the rest of the place had the quality of held breath, of something waiting. She dismounted Duchess at the fence post nearest the gate and looped the reins twice around the wood. Her boots hit the ground and she stood there a moment, just looking at the house, gathering herself. Rebecca Hayes was 26 years old and had, in the last 4 months, lost her father to a fever, her home to a creditor who had wasted no time at all calling in the debt her father had owed, and her last real thread of belonging in the town of Millhaven, where she had been born and raised, and where she was now regarded with a particular brand of pity that felt very much like being erased. She was not a woman who accepted erasure easily. She was 5 feet and 4 inches tall, with dark chestnut hair she kept pinned at the back of her neck and brown eyes that people often described as sharp, though she preferred to think of them as honest. She wore a practical dark wool coat over a blue calico dress, and the dust from 3 days of riding had settled into every seam of both. She looked exactly like what she was, a woman who had come a very long way with very little to lose. She walked up the path to the porch. She knocked on the door. There was a long silence that stretched out in the amber evening, and just when she had decided no one was home or that whoever lived here was not the kind of person who answered doors, she heard footsteps, slow ones, deliberate like a man who was not accustomed to being called toward anything. The door opened. He was tall, considerably taller than she had imagined, with broad shoulders that nearly filled the doorframe and a jaw that carried about 3 days of dark beard. His hair was the color of black coffee, and it had grown a little long at the collar, not from style but from neglect. He wore a plain white shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, dark canvas trousers and suspenders, and he looked at her the way a man looks at something he has not allowed himself to hope for and is not yet sure is real. His eyes were gray, the color of water before a storm. He stood in the doorway and did not speak. Rebecca Hayes looked at Walter Calloway and said, "I am looking for the Calloway Ranch. I was told by a Mr. James Whitfield in Harlan that you might be in need of a housekeeper. I am responding to the posting he put up on my behalf." She paused. "I realize it is evening. I apologize for the hour." Walter Calloway looked at her for another long moment. His expression did not change exactly, but something in it shifted, like a door inside a door being opened. He stepped back. He pulled the door wider. He gestured with one hand toward the interior of the house, and it was the kind of gesture that was simple and complete, and she walked inside. He had not spoken a single word. She would learn later that he had not spoken to a soul in just over 2 years. The inside of the house was clean but spare. There was a stone fireplace on the north wall with a good fire already burning in it, and an iron pot on the hook with something slow cooking inside that smelled of onion and salt pork. There was a long wooden table in the center of the main room with 4 chairs, though one of them had been pushed far against the wall as if to suggest fewer people were expected. There were shelves with provisions, neatly arranged. There was a lamp on the table and another on the mantelpiece, both lit, and their warm light made the room feel less bare than it otherwise might have. Rebecca stood in the center of the room and looked around her. She turned to face Walter, who had closed the door and stood with his back to it, watching her. "I have my own belongings on my horse," she said. "She needs water and feed before anything else. If you will show me where, I will see to her myself." He studied her for another moment, then turned and went to a hook near the door where his hat hung. He put it on and went out the door, holding it open with a backward glance that she understood as an invitation to follow. He led her to the barn. He filled the water trough from a pump beside the barn door. He forked hay from the pile against the far wall and laid it down in the empty stall nearest the door. He did all of this in silence, with the ease of someone who had been alone so long that the presence of another person had not yet fully registered as a change in conditions, or perhaps had registered so completely that words seemed inadequate to address it. Rebecca unsaddled Duchess herself and rubbed her down and settled her in the stall, and she could feel Walter watching her from the barn door with his arms crossed and his shoulder leaning against the wood, and she was careful not to look at him too directly, because something about the way he stood there, contained and still, like a man who had drawn himself into the smallest possible space to avoid taking up more than his share, made her feel a thing she had not expected to feel on the first night of what she had expected to be a business arrangement. She felt the faint, unwanted, and entirely inconvenient beginning of curiosity. She retrieved her canvas traveling bag from behind the saddle and followed him back to the house. Inside, he pointed to a door at the back of the main room, which opened into a small bedroom with a narrow iron bed frame, a washstand, a window that faced west, and a hook on the wall for hanging things. There was a folded quilt on the foot of the bed. The room smelled of cedar and old air, as if it had been shut for a long time, but it was clean. Rebecca set her bag on the bed and turned to find Walter still in the doorway. The lamplight from the main room backlighted him so that his face was mostly in shadow, and she could not read his expression. "Thank you," she said. "This is more than adequate." She hesitated. "My name is Rebecca Hayes. I was told your name is Walter Calloway, so I assume you already know mine from Mr. Whitfield's correspondence if he did write you. I am a good worker. I cook and I clean and I can keep accounts, and I know enough about ranching to be useful where needed. I am not fragile and I am not particular. If there are rules to this arrangement you want me to understand, you can write them down if you prefer." She was not trying to be strange about it. She had been told by James Whitfield, the storekeeper in Harlan who had sent the posting, that Walter Calloway did not speak, had not spoken in some time, and that she should not be alarmed by this or take it as rudeness. Whitfield had not known the full story of it, only that 2 winters ago, after something happened that nobody in Harlan talked about directly, the big dark-haired man who had run the Calloway place had closed himself up in it and hadn't come out much since. He sent a boy named Denny to town once a month for provisions and paid in coin. He kept to himself with a completeness that had become local legend. Rebecca had listened to all of this in Whitfield's store and thought, well, silence is not the worst thing a person can be, and she had taken the posting. Walter looked at her for a moment, then nodded once slowly and turned and went back to the main room. She heard the scrape of a chair and the settling of a man into it, and after she had washed her hands and face at the washstand and changed her outer coat for a clean blouse, she came out and sat down across from him at the table. He had set out 2 bowls. He had ladled the stew from the iron pot into both of them. There was a round of cornbread wrapped in a cloth on the table, and he had placed half in front of her without ceremony or performance. They ate together in silence, and it was, Rebecca thought with some surprise, not an uncomfortable silence, not the kind that pressed on a person and demanded to be filled. It was the silence of two people who were each, in their own way, very tired, sitting close to a warm fire with enough food, and finding that just this was enough for tonight. She thought about asking him how long the posting had been up, or what had happened to the previous housekeeper, or any of a dozen practical questions she would need answers to eventually. She thought about telling him more about herself, about Millhaven and her father and the creditor and the long road here. She thought about asking him what she had come to understand was the central mystery of this place, the silence, the 2 years, whatever it was that had stopped his voice or his willingness to use it. She did none of these things. She ate her stew. She watched the fire. She was going to be here long enough, she thought, to learn what she needed to know. Tonight was not for questions. Tonight was for arriving. When she pushed back her chair and stood to clear the bowls, she glanced at him and found him already watching her with those gray eyes, and the look in them was difficult to name, but she felt it like pressure in the chest, like the beginning of a held breath. She took the bowls to the wash basin without remarking on it, and by the time she came back to bank the fire, he had gone to his own room at the other end of the house, and she heard his door close quietly. Rebecca Hayes stood alone in the main room of the Calloway ranch, with the fire going low and the dark Texas night enormous outside the windows, and she placed one hand flat on the table and breathed slowly and told herself that she was all right, that she was somewhere safe, and that tomorrow she would begin. She was right about all 3 of these things. She was also right that she would not be able to stop thinking about those gray eyes, but that was a problem for a different hour. The first week on the Calloway ranch moved like water steadily, without announcement, finding its own level. Rebecca rose before dawn because she always had, and she found that the kitchen, which occupied the western end of the main room, had everything she needed for a reasonable breakfast if she was creative. There were eggs from the chickens. There was a good iron skillet. There was cornmeal and salt and a crock of lard on the shelf. There was coffee, good coffee, and a pot that had clearly been used every single morning for years. She made breakfast the first morning before Walter appeared, and when he came out of his room already dressed for the day, he stopped at the sight of the table set for 2, and something passed across his face that was quick and complicated, and then he sat down and ate without remarking on it, except that when she refilled his coffee cup from the pot, he looked up at her and gave the smallest nod, and she understood it as a thank you and accepted it as one. She learned the shape of the ranch in those first days by walking it and watching. The Calloway place ran about 300 acres, most of it open grazing land with a creek that cut through the southern pasture and a stand of post oak along the eastern edge that gave the cattle some shade in the afternoon heat. The herd was modest, perhaps 40 head of longhorn cattle, well kept, and there were also 6 horses, including Duchess and the chickens, and a pair of mules for the heavy work. Walter worked from sunup to well past sundown. He was the kind of man who moved through labor the way some men moved through prayer, quietly, steadily, with complete attention. She watched him from the kitchen window some mornings as he worked the horses in the corral, and there was something in the way he handled them that struck her as deeply gentle. He never raised his voice, of course. He communicated with his body, with slow movement and extended hands, and the horses responded to him with a trust that she found affecting. He had a dog, too. A large, tawny thing with floppy ears and a serious face named Biscuit, who followed him everywhere with devoted silence, as if he had chosen a companion to match his temperament. Biscuit approved of Rebecca after 2 days, which she took as a professional endorsement. By the end of the first week, she had established a rhythm. Breakfast at 6, the washing and mending as needed through the morning. She had discovered that the small room off the back of the kitchen was being used as a sort of storage, but would serve much better as an actual pantry with some reorganizing, and she reorganized it on the 3rd day. She found the household accounts in a wooden box on the shelf above the fireplace, a ledger in a firm, careful hand, tracking provisions and expenses with precision, and she reviewed them and made note of what was running low. On the 7th day, she walked to the barn to ask Walter a question about the accounts, specifically about a payment listed simply as fence work, Southern Quarter, August, and whether that was an ongoing arrangement or a one-time cost, because she wanted to plan the household budget properly. She found him in the barn working on a bridle, seated on an upturned crate, with the leather across his knee and an awl in his hand. Biscuit was asleep in the straw nearby. The late morning light came through the open barn door in one long golden stripe. Walter looked up when she came in. Rebecca held up the ledger and opened to the page in question and brought it to him, pointing to the line she meant. She said, "I want to understand the accounts properly so I can plan provisioning. Is this a recurring expense for fence repair or is it done?" He looked at the page. He took the ledger from her gently and turned it slightly in his hands. He reached into the front pocket of his shirt and drew out a small pencil, short enough to be almost funny, and he wrote below the line in that same careful hand, "Done. No recur. Good now." He handed the ledger back. Rebecca looked at the words. She looked at him. "Good," she said. "Thank you." He picked up his awl and went back to the bridle. She stood there a moment longer than she needed to, watching the way his hands worked the leather, the quiet sureness of it. And then she walked back to the house and spent the rest of the morning planning the provision order for town, and tried not to think too much about the fact that his handwriting was very fine for a man who seemed to have given up on communicating almost entirely. She wrote the provision list, and she added a note at the bottom requesting a small journal and 2 good pencils, and she left the list on the table where he would find it before the monthly trip to town. He found it that evening. She watched him read it from the corner of her eye while she was mending a shirt near the window. When he got to the bottom of the list, he paused. He looked at the additional request for the journal and pencils. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he folded the list and put it in his shirt pocket without any expression she could read, and that was that. When Denny arrived the following Tuesday, a boy of about 15 with a wide freckled face and a mule cart, Walter sent him to town with the list, and when Denny came back in the late afternoon and unloaded the provisions at the kitchen door, there among the flour and coffee and lamp oil was a small journal with a brown cloth cover and 2 new pencils, sharpened. Walter left them on the kitchen table without ceremony. Rebecca picked them up and turned them over in her hands and felt something warm and specific in her chest, and she placed the journal and pencils on the counter near where she worked. And from that day forward, when there was something that required communication between them, she could write in the journal and leave it open, and he would read it and write back in that careful, measured hand. And in this way a conversation began, slow and quiet as a creek finding its course, but unmistakably, undeniably. A conversation. She asked him, one evening in the 2nd week, in the journal she left on the table before bed, "What should I know about the ranch that I haven't figured out yet?" She found the journal the next morning closed on the kitchen counter. She opened it. Below her question, in the firm hand she had come to recognize like a voice, "The south fence post near the big rock is loose. Don't lean on it. The bay mare on the end will nip if she's startled. Coffee needs to be strong or there is no point. The well rope sticks on cold mornings, pull left." Rebecca read the list sitting at the kitchen table with her first cup of coffee of the morning, which she had made very strong, and she laughed, actually laughed, quietly to herself and wrote beneath his list, "I had already made the coffee strong. I am glad we agree on this." And below that, after a moment, "Thank you for trusting me with the fence post." When she came back from hanging the washing that afternoon, he had written, "You're welcome." The days built on each other like the walls of something being constructed with patience and care. She learned that he took his coffee outside most mornings, sitting on the porch with Biscuit beside him, looking east over the pasture with the expression of a man who was in conversation with the landscape. She learned that he often went out at night, not for any task she could identify, but simply to walk, moving out across the grass under the enormous Texas sky until he was a dark shape at the edge of her vision from the porch. She learned that he kept a small shelf of books in his room. She could see it through the doorway when the door was open, which was rarely, and that he must have read them repeatedly, because the spines were soft and worn. She learned that he was 32 years old, that he had built the ranch house himself with help from two men he did not name, and that his family had homesteaded this land when he was a boy and he had stayed when everyone else had gone. And she knew there was a whole history living in that last sentence, in the word gone. But she did not press it. She also learned, slowly, in the way you learn things about people when the ordinary business of living together is the only curriculum available, that Walter Calloway was one of the most genuinely decent men she had ever encountered. He fixed things before she asked. He left the fire laid in the morning so she did not have to start from scratch in the cold. When a bad storm came through in the third week and took half the porch roof with it, and Rebecca came out to find the rain coming sideways into the main room through the broken section, Walter was already on the roof in the gray dawn with a hammer and shingles before she had finished pulling on her coat. She stood in the yard in the rain and looked up at him, and he looked down at her from the roof with water running off the brim of his hat, and she shouted up, "I can hand things up to you," and he pointed to the pile of shingles on the ground beside the ladder, and they worked together in the rain for 2 hours until the roof was sealed. And when they came back inside and she made a fresh pot of coffee, and they sat on opposite sides of the table and dripped onto the floor while they warmed up. It was one of those unremarkable and also somehow enormously significant moments, the kind that don't announce themselves as important but are. 4 weeks into her time at the Calloway Ranch, Rebecca discovered what had happened 2 years ago. She did not discover it from Walter. She discovered it from Denny, who was a sweet and largely guileless boy who had been delivering provisions to the ranch since he was 12, and who, on the day he came by to collect an extra list she had sent word about through one of the neighboring ranch hands, sat in the kitchen doorway and ate the biscuits she gave him, and talked to her with the comfortable ease of someone who assumed everyone knew everything he knew. He told her that Walter Calloway had had a wife. Her name had been Clara. She had come to the ranch as a bride 8 years ago, and she had been, by everyone's account, a wonderful woman, bright and laughing and capable, exactly the kind of woman the land asked a person to be. They had been happy, Denny said, in the way that was obvious from the outside, the kind of couple that made people in town feel good about things just by being what they were. 3 years into their marriage, Clara had been with child. It had been a difficult pregnancy, and Clara had not been as strong as either of them had hoped. In the winter of 1880, she had gone into labor early, during a cold snap that sealed the roads in ice and made the 10-mile ride into Harlan to fetch the doctor a nightmare of a journey. Walter had made the ride himself, there and back in conditions that would have stopped most men. But by the time they returned, Clara was gone. The baby, a boy, had not survived the night that followed. Denny told her all of this without any dramatic emphasis, in the simple and straightforward manner of a boy who has absorbed a piece of local history and recites it as fact. And Rebecca sat very still across from him and felt the weight of it settle on her like something physical. After Denny left, she sat at the kitchen table for a long time. She thought about Walter coming home to this house in January of 1880 with a doctor who arrived too late. She thought about the 4 chairs at the table, one of them pushed against the wall. She thought about the way he walked to the edge of the pasture at night under the sky. She thought about 2 years of silence, of a man who had drawn down every external thing until there was only the work and the land and the animals and the vast quiet Texas sky, as if he were trying to reduce himself to something that couldn't be hurt anymore. She thought about the gray eyes watching her across the dinner table. She thought about the small pencil in his shirt pocket. She thought about coffee needs to be strong or there is no point. That evening when they sat down to supper, she looked at him more directly than she usually permitted herself to, and he looked back at her with those gray eyes that seemed, in the lamplight, to hold something that was the opposite of closed off, something attentive and present, something that watched her with a specificity that was almost unbearable in its gentleness. She said quietly, "I heard about Clara today. From Denny, I'm sorry. I want you to know that I am sorry." His hands, which had been around his coffee cup, tightened slightly. He was very still for a moment. Then he nodded, a single, slow nod that was somehow complete, that acknowledged what she had said and that she had said it, and that he had heard it and that it mattered, and that was all he had for it, and all he needed to give. She did not say anything else. She did not try to smooth it over or reduce it to something more manageable. She simply let it be what it was, and they ate supper. And afterward she washed up while he sat in his chair by the fire. And Biscuit put his big head in Walter's lap, and Walter's hand moved slowly over the dog's ears, and the fire popped and settled. That night before she went to bed, Rebecca wrote in the journal, "I won't ask more than you want to give. I only wanted you to know that I see this place, and I think it was very full once, and I think it is still worth something." She left the journal on the table and went to her room. In the morning there were 2 lines in Walter's handwriting beneath hers. It was, and it is. She read those 4 words standing in the kitchen in the early light before the fire was even built, and she pressed one hand against her sternum as if she needed to keep something inside from getting too loud. The 6th week, a thing happened that changed the texture of the air between them permanently. Rebecca had gone to the south pasture to check on the cattle, a task she had begun taking on in the afternoons to give Walter more time for the fence and irrigation work that needed doing before the weather turned. She had gotten comfortable on horseback again, and she liked the afternoons out in the open country, the enormous sky and the smell of grass and the long, slow peace of it. She had not noticed how long she had been out, and the light was failing fast when she turned Duchess toward home. The creek crossing at the south pasture was not a difficult one in ordinary conditions, but there had been rain 2 days ago and the banks had softened, and when Duchess went down the bank too quickly, she slid in the mud and Rebecca came off sideways and went into the creek. It was not deep. The water came to her waist. But the creek was cold and running with some purpose after the rain, and she lost her footing on the slick rock bottom twice before she got hold of a root on the near bank and hauled herself out. And Duchess had already crossed easily and was standing on the far bank looking at her with the dignified indifference of a horse who has made her opinion known. Rebecca pulled herself up the bank and stood dripping in the gray evening light and took a personal inventory. She was wet and cold and one knee was bruised from the rocky bottom, and her dignity was in rough condition, but she was otherwise all right. She walked Duchess home. She came in through the front gate as the last of the light went from the sky, and Walter was on the porch. He must have seen her coming across the pasture from the high point near the barn, because he was already coming down the porch steps as she came through the gate, and when he got close enough to see the state of her soaked through, hair loose and wet, muddy up to the hips, he stopped. The expression that crossed his face was so immediate and unguarded that Rebecca felt it like a hand on her shoulder. It was concern, raw and immediate, without any of the careful distance he maintained as his general practice. It was the face of a man who had been afraid and then seen her and was still partly afraid. She said quickly, "I am all right. I came off Duchess at the South Creek. It was my own fault. I was not paying attention to the bank. I am cold and I need dry clothes, but I am not hurt." He came forward and took Duchess's reins from her without a word, and he gestured toward the house with his chin. And the gesture was so urgent and genuine that she almost laughed, except that she was shivering and the laugh might not have come out right. She went inside and changed her clothes and put her wet things over the back of her chair near the fire, and when Walter came in from seeing to Duchess, he went directly to the fire and built it up from a low burn to something serious, and he went to the kitchen and came back with a blanket that he set on her chair, and he put a kettle on the hook over the fire. He moved around her with the efficiency of someone who knew exactly what to do and was doing it, and Rebecca sat in the chair wrapped in the blanket and watched him and felt something go entirely soft in the center of her chest in a way that was becoming impossible to argue with. When the kettle was ready, he made a cup of tea, not coffee, tea, which meant he had been paying close enough attention to know that she kept a tin of dried chamomile on the second shelf from the left, and that she made herself a cup of it sometimes in the evenings before bed. He set the cup in her hands and stood back and looked at her, and his eyes were doing the thing they did where they said the sentences the rest of him was not going to say. Rebecca wrapped both hands around the cup and held his gaze and said, softly, "Thank you, Walter." The sound of his name in her mouth did something she had not anticipated. He had a slight physical response to it, a kind of stillness that was different from his usual stillness, a stillness that had attention in it, that had recognition. And he looked at her for a moment longer than usual before he went and sat down in his own chair and picked up the mending that happened to be there, and looked at it as if he was interested in it, which she was quite certain he was not. She drank her tea and was warm again, and Biscuit came and put his head on her knee, and the fire was very good, and outside the Texas night was dark and full of stars, and Rebecca Hayes sat in the Calloway ranch house wrapped in a blanket and thought, clearly and without great surprise, that she was in trouble of the best possible kind. She wrote in the journal that night, "I am glad I am here." She went asleep before he had a chance to write back. In the morning the journal had 3 words. "So am I." The weeks that followed had a quality Rebecca would later struggle to describe, because they were unremarkable in their surface and entirely remarkable in their substance. Nothing dramatic occurred. They rose and worked and ate and went to sleep. The weather changed, cooling as October moved toward November, and the ranch work shifted with it. The cattle were moved to the lower pasture where the grass was better through the winter. The garden was cut back and turned. The barn was winterized, the gaps in the siding patched, and the hay loft stocked. They worked side by side on these tasks, often without any words at all, and Rebecca found that she had stopped experiencing the silence as something unusual or even as a characteristic of Walter so much as a characteristic of the particular air between them, something that made room for things that talking might have crowded out. She noticed things. She noticed that he always positioned himself between her and any animal that was being unpredictable without making any production of it. She noticed that when he read in the evenings, he would sometimes pause on a page for a long time, not reading, just thinking, and that his face in those moments was genuinely beautiful in the way that completely unguarded faces are. She noticed that he had started taking his morning coffee on the porch a few minutes later than he used to, which was exactly when she came out to do the morning feeding, and that they now often stood at the porch rail together for a few minutes in the early light, drinking their coffee, looking out at the pasture, before the day began properly. She noticed that the 4 chairs at the table no longer felt like a count of absence. 3 of them were still pushed back, unused, every meal, but the 2 they sat in felt like enough. One evening in late October, she was at the kitchen counter rolling out dough for biscuits, and she heard him come in from the barn, and she was aware of him pausing behind her in the main room, and then he came to the kitchen doorway and leaned against the frame with his arms crossed, watching her work, and she said without turning, "There is something on your mind." She felt rather than heard him react to this a shift of weight, a quality of attention that changed. She turned and looked at him. He was watching her with those gray eyes, and the expression in them was the most open she had seen on him yet, something that lived somewhere between uncertain and determined, like a man standing at the edge of something and not quite ready to step off. He straightened. He went to the table and picked up the journal and sat down. He wrote for what was, given his usual brevity, a considerable length of time. Then he brought the journal to the counter and set it open beside her bowl of dough and stepped back. She wiped her hands on her apron and read. He had written, "I know you came here for work and that this was a practical arrangement and that I have not been easy company. I know I am not easy to understand. I know this is not what you expected your life to be. But I want to tell you that these weeks have been the first time in 2 years that this house has felt like a house and not just a building I sleep in, and I know that is because of you, and I want you to know that I know that." Rebecca read it once. She read it again. Her hands had stilled on the edge of the journal. She looked up at him. He was standing with his back against the counter across from her, and he looked like a man who had said the bravest thing he had ever said and was waiting to find out what it cost him. She said, "Walter." He held very still. She said, "I came here for work, yes. But I have stayed because I want to stay. And it has been a very long time since anywhere felt like where I was supposed to be." She paused. "I think this is it." Something happened in his face. The particular architecture of his stillness rearranged itself entirely, and what was underneath it was something she recognized from her own chest, the careful, complicated feeling of wanting something you have not let yourself want for long enough that the wanting itself feels like danger. She reached across the counter and picked up the pencil and wrote beneath his words, "I think so too." He looked at what she had written. He looked at her. He reached out and took the pencil from her fingers, and his hand closed very briefly over hers in the process, warm and solid and deliberate. And then he set the pencil down and took a slow breath and gave her the closest thing to a smile she had seen on him yet. It was not a large smile. It lived mostly in the lines around his eyes and the slight softening of his jaw, and it was the most significant thing she had ever seen on another person's face. She went back to her biscuits, and he went back to wherever it was he went in the evenings, but the air between them was different. Not charged exactly, but awake, present in a new way. The following Sunday, after the morning work was done, Walter appeared at the door of the main room wearing his good coat, the dark wool one she had seen hanging on the peg by the door since her first day and had never seen him take down, and his hat, and he had Duchess saddled in the yard along with his own horse, a big dark bay named Reckoning. Rebecca looked at the two saddled horses and looked at him. "Where are we going?" she asked. He went to the table and wrote, "There is something I want to show you. If you want to come." She got her coat. He took her south, across the pasture and through the post oaks along the creek, following a path she had not found on her own explorations. The trees thinned and the land rose slightly into a limestone ridge, and at the top of the ridge was a view that stopped the breath. It was a wide valley below, lined with cottonwood trees that had gone gold and copper with the season, and the creek wound through it in long, lazy curves, and in the distance where the valley narrowed, there was a natural stone formation, several tall slabs of limestone standing in a rough semicircle like something arranged deliberately, which perhaps once they had been, though by whom or for what purpose was lost to a time before anyone living had records for. The late October sun was low and gold and perfect. They sat on their horses at the top of the ridge and looked at it, and Rebecca felt the beauty of it the way you feel music in the chest, behind the sternum, as something larger than the body can entirely contain. She said, "It is the most beautiful thing I have ever seen." He was quiet beside her, as he always was, but she looked at him, and he was not looking at the valley. He was looking at her, and the expression on his face was so unguarded, so completely without armor, that she felt it land on her like sunlight, warm and total and impossible to look away from. She did not look away. He did not look away either. The horses were patient animals, and the afternoon was long, and they sat on the ridge for a considerable time, not touching, not speaking, looking sometimes at the golden valley and sometimes at each other, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was the beginning of everything. November came in cold, and with it came the first frost, which settled on the grass and the roof of the barn and made the mornings look like something from a fairy story. Rebecca found she loved the Calloway ranch in winter even more than she had in the burnished fall, because winter made the fire inside more precious, and the walls more necessary, and the closeness of two people in the same space feel like something the season itself was advocating for. They had settled into a new kind of ordinary. The journal was still used, but less for practical things and more for the kind of exchange that people do when they want to reach for each other and aren't sure of the distance. She would write something in the evenings and he would write back, and she saved every entry, every page of that journal, because each one was a stone in a path that was being laid with extraordinary care. She had also, by November, stopped trying to pretend that what she felt for Walter Calloway was anything other than what it was. She was in love with him. She had been in some degree of love with him since approximately the rain-soaked morning on the porch roof, if not before, and the love had grown with each passing week into something serious and permanent and entirely beyond her control, which she found she did not particularly want to control anyway. What she did not know was where he stood. She had the evidence of his care, his attention, the warmth in those gray eyes, the way his hand had closed over hers for one brief moment in October. But Walter Calloway was not a man whose interior landscape was easily mapped, and she would not push him towards something he was not ready for. She had patience. She had time. She was staying. The moment when everything clarified came on a Thursday in the second week of November. She had been in the barn replacing the hinges on one of the stall doors, a task she had decided to take on herself because it needed doing and Walter was out mending the south fence. She had been at it for about an hour and was nearly done when she heard Biscuit bark outside, a single sharp bark that was different from his usual ones, and she heard hoofbeats. She came out of the barn to find two men on horseback at the gate. They were not from Harlan, or at least she had not seen them in her monthly trips to town. One was heavyset, in a stained brown coat, and the other was lean and mustached, and they both had the particular quality of men who went through the world looking for what they could take from it. The heavyset one had already dismounted and was at the porch door knocking, and when Rebecca came out of the barn he turned and looked at her with a kind of flat assessment that made her skin tight. "You the woman of the house," he said. "I work here," Rebecca said, keeping her voice level. "Mr. Calloway is on the property. What is your business?" "Looking to water our horses and maybe buy some provisions," the mustached one said from his saddle, and his tone was reasonable enough but his eyes were not. "The trough is at the side of the barn," Rebecca said. "You're welcome to water your horses. I'm not in a position to sell provisions without Mr. Calloway say so." "Well then," said the heavyset one, and he was looking at her in a way that had very little to do with provisions. She heard the dogs bark again, differently this time, and then she heard hoofbeats coming up from the south at a canter, and Walter came through the south gate on reckoning at a pace that was not casual. He must have seen the strange horses from across the field. He was off his horse before it had fully stopped, and he came to stand between Rebecca and the two men with a quietness that was more impressive than any amount of noise would have been. He stood there and looked at both of them, one after the other. He was still holding his fence-mending tools in one hand. His face was absolutely calm. His eyes were not. The heavyset man looked at Walter and then at the tools in his hand and then at Walter's face and made some internal calculation. "Just looking for water," the mustached one said again, more carefully this time. Walter looked at the trough, which they could see clearly, and then looked back at both men with an expression that said, as plainly as if he had spoken it, "Get what you came for and leave." They watered their horses and left. Walter watched them down the road until they were gone and then turned to Rebecca, and the look on his face now was something different, the residue of a fear quickly controlled, the aftermath of something that had made his blood move fast. She said, "I was all right. I handled it fine." He looked at her for a moment. Then very deliberately, he reached out and took her hand in both of his. It was the first time he had done that with intention, without the incidental pretext of the pencil or the tools. He simply held her hand, gently, firmly, with the quiet certainty of a man who has made a decision he should have made sooner. Rebecca looked down at their joined hands and then up at his face, and what she saw there made her heart beat in a way that was quite disorganized and not at all ladylike. She turned her hand over in his and held back, equally deliberately, and he watched this with those gray eyes, and the look in them was something she would remember for the rest of her life. She would not be able to say it better than this. It was the look of a man who had come back from somewhere very far away and found someone waiting, and the finding of it was almost too much to bear, and exactly the right amount to bear, both at once. They stood in the yard in the November cold, holding hands beside the barn, while Biscuit sat at their feet and regarded the middle distance with professional detachment, and the sky above was pale blue and enormous, and nothing in particular needed to be said. That evening after supper, Walter did not sit in his usual chair. He sat beside her on the bench along the wall, close enough that their arms almost touched, and he opened the journal on the table in front of them and wrote, "I have been wanting to tell you something for a while." She leaned slightly to read it and then looked at him, waiting. He wrote, "I know what happened to Clara. I know what those 2 years were. I know what I have been. I also know that I am not that man anymore, or I don't want to be, and I want you to know that whatever you thought you came here for, I would like it to be something more than that if you are willing." He pushed the journal toward her and set the pencil on top. Rebecca picked up the pencil. She wrote, "I am more than willing. I have been willing since the second week, if you want to know the truth. I was only waiting for you to be ready." He read it. He set the journal down. He looked at her for a long moment, that careful, complete gray gaze, and then he reached up and tucked a loose piece of her hair back from her face with a touch so light and so careful that it felt like a question and an answer at the same time. She turned toward him and he was already there, close enough now that she could see the small scar at the edge of his jaw she had noticed weeks ago and never asked about, and she did not ask about it now. She reached up and put her hand against the side of his face, and he closed his eyes for a moment and turned his face very slightly into her palm like a man who had been cold for a very long time and is finally, cautiously, letting himself be warm. Then he opened his eyes and kissed her. It was a quiet kiss. It was not timid. There was nothing timid about Walter Calloway, but it was careful and tender and complete, like everything he did. And when it was done, he pressed his forehead against hers and breathed, and she breathed, and Biscuit snored on the rug, and the fire settled, and the November wind moved over the house and found it sealed. Rebecca Hayes put both arms around Walter Calloway and held on, and he put his arms around her and held back, and she thought that this precise moment and this specific man and this quiet particular life was what she had been riding toward for 3 days 3 months ago across the red dust of Texas. She had not known it then. She knew it now. Winter deepened. The ranch was blanketed in a cold that was dry and bright, and the days were short and golden, and the nights were very long, and Rebecca did not mind any of it. The fire in the main room burned all day and into the night, and there was always something warm on the stove, and the journal on the table was now so full that Walter had to go into Harlan himself, not Denny himself, for the first time in over 2 years to get a new one, which he did on a Friday in December. And when he came back, he had also brought a length of blue ribbon that he set on the table beside the new journal without explanation. Rebecca picked up the ribbon and looked at him across the table. "What is this for?" He took the journal and wrote in it in the new blank first page, his neat and careful hand, "I thought it might suit you. You can tell me if I am wrong." She laughed. She shook her head. She said, "You are not wrong," and she tied the ribbon in her hair and went back to what she was doing, and Walter sat in his chair with the quiet satisfaction of a man who is learning, again, how to be happy and finding it less frightening than he expected. He was speaking more. It had begun gradually, without announcement. The first word she heard him say aloud had been in November, when Biscuit had gone out in the yard and come back with a porcupine quill in his nose, and Walter had come into the kitchen and said, in a voice that was slightly rough from disuse but unmistakably clear, "Dog." She had turned from the counter to find him holding Biscuit's collar and the dog looking aggrieved, and she had helped remove the quill, and nothing had been made of the speaking of the word except that they both knew it had happened. After that, words came back slowly, like a stream recovering after a drought, first a trickle, then a flow. Not torrential, not chatty. Walter Calloway was never going to be a man who filled every silence, and she didn't want him to be. But he began to speak to her in the mornings and the evenings, short sentences, direct and quiet, and each one landed with the particular weight of something that had been held for a long time and was now being released with care. He said her name, and it was like being recognized in a language she had not realized she was waiting to hear. He said Rebecca, the way the landscape said everything simply, with full attention, meaning one thing and only one thing. She told him about Millhaven. She told him about her father, Thomas Hayes, who had been a clever man and not a practical one, who had loved books and had moderate luck at cards, and who had made her feel, her entire childhood, that she was the most interesting person he had ever met. She told him about the debt and the house and the creditor who had come with 2 men and a wagon, and how she had stood on the porch and watched her father's furniture be loaded into that wagon with a feeling of cold, absolute clarity, that the life she had been living was over and the next one had not yet begun, and that she would have to build it herself from the ground up. Walter listened to all of this with the full, undivided attention he gave everything. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Your father sounds like he was worth having." It was such a simple sentence, and it broke open something she had been keeping sealed, and she cried a little, which she had not allowed herself to do since she left Millhaven, and Walter handed her his handkerchief without any fuss and moved his chair closer and put his arm around her, and she leaned against him and felt the solid, warm steadiness of him. And she thought that this was the other thing about Walter Calloway, alongside all the gentleness, alongside the care and the attention and the gray eyes and the quiet ways, he was simply, reliably, entirely there. He did not waver. He did not disappear. He was as solid as the limestone house he had built with his own hands, and she could lean against him and he would hold. Christmas came. It was not an extravagant affair. The ranch did not run to extravagance, but Rebecca made a plum pudding from a recipe she carried in her memory from her mother, and she hung dried sage and cedar along the mantelpiece, and she put a candle in each window on Christmas Eve the way her father always had. Walter came in from the barn on Christmas morning and stopped in the doorway of the main room and looked at the room with its cedar smell and its candles, and the table set with the good cloth she had found in the chest at the bottom of the hall, and the expression on his face was something she would not describe to anyone because it was not hers to describe. He had made her something. He brought it out from his room on Christmas morning and set it on the table in front of her, a wooden box, small and square, with the lid carved in a design of flowers and a long trailing vine, made from a piece of the cedar that had come off the old porch section in the storm. She knew it was from the porch because she recognized the particular red-gold color of the grain. She opened the box. Inside it was lined with a piece of soft leather, and nested in the leather was the original small pencil from his shirt pocket, the one he had used to write those first words to her in her first week on the ranch. She looked at it for a long time. She looked at him. He said, "I thought you might want to keep it." She closed the box and held it with both hands and said, "I am going to keep it forever." He said, "Good," and sat down to his Christmas breakfast, and Biscuit tried to steal a piece of cornbread from the table, and Rebecca laughed and caught him in time, and outside the Christmas sky was blue and cloudless, and the light on the pasture was the color of honey. In the new year of 1883, Walter Calloway asked Rebecca Hayes to marry him. He did not do it with great ceremony. He was not a man for great ceremony. They had been out checking the herd on a bright January morning, and they were riding back along the ridge where he had taken her that first Sunday, and the cottonwoods in the valley below were bare and gray now, but the limestone slabs stood in their ancient circle in the low winter light, and he stopped reckoning at the top of the ridge, and she stopped Duchess beside him, and he said, looking at the valley, "I would like you to be my wife, if you want that too." He turned and looked at her. The directness of those gray eyes, without any of the careful management he applied when he was unsure of himself, told her that this was simply the truth, stated plainly, the way he always stated things. She said, "Yes, Walter, I want that very much." He let out a breath that had a quality of held weight to it, as if he had been braced for a different answer, and was now adjusting to the right one. And then he smiled at her, really smiled, a full and unguarded smile that was extremely difficult to survive with composure. And he leaned across from his saddle and kissed her once, firmly, And then they rode back to the ranch side by side in the winter light. And there was the kind of joy that does not need announcing because it is already everywhere. They were married in March in the small Harlan town church, on a Saturday when the early spring was just beginning to show itself in the mesquite trees, pale new leaves no bigger than a thumbnail on the gray wood. Denny came, grinning enormously. James Whitfield came with his wife and daughter. The preacher, a lean older man named Reverend Hooper, who had been doing business with God in this corner of Texas for 20 years, performed a simple ceremony with a warmth that suggested he was very glad to see Walter Calloway come through his doors. Rebecca wore her best dress, a dark blue wool that was not bridal white but was hers and suited her exactly, and she had the blue ribbon in her hair that Walter had brought her from Harlan in December. She carried a small bunch of dried sage she had tied with twine, because there were no flowers in March in this part of Texas, and sage smelled like the land, and the land was theirs. Walter stood beside her at the front of the church in his good coat, hat in his hands, and when Reverend Hooper asked him to say his vows, he said them clearly and fully, in his measured, quiet voice, and meant every word with a completeness that was entirely evident to every person in that small church. He placed a ring on her finger, a simple gold band, plain and unadorned, which was right, and when the Reverend said he could kiss his bride, Walter Calloway put one hand against Rebecca's face very gently and kissed her, and the people in the small church made a warm sound of collective approval, and Biscuit, who had been left outside and was not happy about it, barked once from the churchyard as if to add his own endorsement. They drove home in the wagon in the late afternoon, and the light on the land was the particular gold of early spring, and Rebecca sat close beside Walter on the wagon seat with her shoulder against his arm, and he held the reins in one hand and put the other around her shoulders, and she thought that the whole of her life had been a road toward this exact wagon seat on this exact afternoon, and she was not wrong. The spring was busy, as ranch springs always are. The herd had come through the winter well, and there were calves to manage. The garden needed planting. Rebecca expanded it considerably from the modest plot it had been, adding pole beans and squash and more tomatoes than strictly necessary, because she found gardening one of the most satisfying things a person could do with their hands. She roped Walter into the expansion one Saturday, and he spent the day digging rows with patience and without complaint, which she told him was a very admirable quality in a husband, and he said dryly that he would try to maintain it. He was talking more each week, not filling silence, never that, but present in speech the way he was present in everything, attentive and deliberate, and increasingly warm. He had a way of saying quiet, dry things that made her laugh that she had not anticipated, this hidden seam of dry humor that showed itself in small doses, and was all the more delightful for its rarity. In April he told her more about Clara, not because she asked, she never asked, but because he chose to, one evening when they were sitting on the porch in the early spring dark, watching the first fireflies of the season in the grass beyond the fence. He told her about Clara's laugh, which he said could be heard from the barn. He told her about the way she had insisted on painting the porch railing blue, which Rebecca had noticed and had wondered about, the blue paint still showing in patches under the weathered gray. He told her about the day he had known the baby was gone, and how the silence after that had not been a choice so much as the only thing he had left to fill with, and how it had become a habit and then a condition, and then something he had not known how to reverse. He said, "You reversed it." Rebecca sat beside him in the spring night and said, "No, you did. I just knocked on the door." He looked at her for a long moment. He said, "You knocked and I opened it." She said, "You opened it like you had been waiting." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I think I had been. I just didn't know for who." She reached over and found his hand in the dark and held it, and the fireflies were rising in the grass, and the spring air smelled of damp earth and new things, and somewhere in the south pasture the cattle were settling for the night, and Biscuit was asleep across the doorway behind them like a furry threshold guardian, and everything was exactly as it should be. Summer came in gold and green and full. The ranch was thriving in a way that had not been the case in the 2 years of Walter's solitary maintenance of it. Not because he had been negligent, but because one person cannot do the work of two people fully. And with Rebecca managing the house and accounts and the garden, and increasingly the chickens and the occasional fence work, and with Walter's steady labor on the herd and the land, the place had a renewed vigor that people in Harlan noticed. James Whitfield told Walter in town one July morning that the Calloway ranch looked better than it had in years, and Walter, who was becoming more comfortable in the world outside his gate as the months passed, said thank you in a way that was still spare but no longer barricaded. The community was kind to them, by and large. Rebecca found her place in Harlan's small social life with the practical ease of someone who has dealt with harder things than church socials, and she was liked for her directness and her competence, and the fact that she made very good pie, which she brought to the church bake sales and which created a favorable impression. There was talk, as there always is in a small town, about the speed of their courtship. She had been at the ranch less than 6 months before they were married, but the talk was mostly good-natured, because people liked Walter and were glad to see him among them again, and they approved of the woman who had brought him back. There was one woman, a Mrs. Horace Finch, who was not among the approving, and who made several pointed remarks about the impropriety of a woman living alone with a bachelor before any formal arrangement had been made. But Rebecca met these remarks with a steady, pleasant smile and an utter refusal to be diminished by them, and Mrs. Finch eventually found other targets for her attention. In August, Rebecca knew she was expecting a child. She told Walter on a Tuesday evening, sitting at the kitchen table with the journal in front of her, though she did not write it in the journal this time. She simply looked at him and said, "I need to tell you something." He gave her his full attention, which he always did. She said, "We are going to have a baby. In the spring, I think." The silence that followed was very short. It was not the silence of shock or dismay. It was the silence of a man who was receiving news of such magnitude that he needed to sit completely still with it for a moment to let it be real. Then he stood up from his chair and came around the table and took her face in both his hands and looked at her for a long, searching moment. And what was in his eyes was something she had no name for, a depth of feeling that was joy and grief and hope all at once, the particular emotion available only to people who have lost and then been given back more than they thought they deserved. He said very quietly, "Are you well? Are you all right?" She said, "I am perfectly well. I am very well." He nodded slowly, still holding her face. He said, "All right." Then he sat back in his chair and pulled it close to hers and took her hand on the table, and they sat there together in the warm kitchen, and the magnitude of it settled on them both like the best kind of weight. He was very attentive through the pregnancy, which she had expected but which was still touching in its constancy. He took on the heavier physical work without discussion. He made sure there was always wood split and water drawn. He did not fuss or treat her as fragile. Rebecca made very clear early that she would not be treated as fragile, but he was present in a way that was thorough and unwavering, and she understood it. He had held this fear before, and it was still in him, and the way he managed it was not to suffocate her with worry but to stay close, to keep his hands on the things he could tend to and trust her with the rest. She trusted herself too. She was strong and healthy, and the pregnancy was a good one. She was tired in the early months and then full of energy through the late fall, working in the garden until it was too cold, reorganizing the house in ways that made perfect sense to her, preparing the small room off the back of the kitchen, which had been a pantry and before that a storage room, for its new purpose, painting the walls a warm white and making a crib from a pattern she found in one of the books on Walter's shelf. Walter helped her with the crib. They built it on weekend evenings in November, at the kitchen table with the lamp turned up, and it was the best kind of work, purposeful and shared, with their heads bent over the same task, and the warm winter kitchen and Biscuit asleep on the rug and the fire going. He painted the headboard of the crib with a small pattern of flowers and a trailing vine, matching the carving on the cedar box he had made for her at Christmas the year before. And Rebecca ran her fingers over the painted wood and felt the thread of care running through it, the same care that was in everything he made. And she thought that this child, whoever they were, was going to arrive into a great deal of love, and she was very glad. Spring came in March of 1884 with warmth and new grass and the early wildflowers along the creek bank, the bluebonnets and Indian paintbrush painting the pasture in blue and orange. Rebecca had planned well and had arranged for Dr. Ambrose from Harlan to be summoned with adequate lead time, and when her labor began on a Tuesday morning at the end of March, Walter rode to town himself in the early hours with reckoning at a fast canter and came back with the doctor by mid-morning. The labor was long but not complicated, and by the late afternoon of that Tuesday, while the spring light was falling golden and warm through the bedroom window, Rebecca Hayes Calloway brought a son into the world. He was healthy and loud and very certain about his opinions from the first moment, which Rebecca took as a favorable sign of character. He had dark hair, black coffee dark, which matched his father's exactly, and his eyes, when they opened, were the particular unfocused blue of newborns that would eventually become, as the weeks passed, a clear and unmistakable gray. Walter sat on the edge of the bed when the doctor had gone and the house was quiet, and Rebecca placed the baby in his arms, and Walter held his son with the same careful, deliberate sureness he brought to everything, and looked at him for a very long time without speaking. Rebecca watched her husband hold their child and did not say anything either, because there was nothing to say that would have added to what was already perfectly complete. Walter looked up at her at last and his eyes were bright and he said very quietly, "What do you want to call him?" Rebecca had been thinking about this for months. She said, "I want to call him Thomas for my father if you are willing." Walter said, "Thomas." He looked at the baby. He said, "Thomas Calloway." He nodded slowly. "That is right." Thomas Calloway came home to the Calloway Ranch in the spring of 1884, and the house, which had been many things in its time, empty, silent, full of held breath and memory and grief, and then gradually warming, and then genuinely alive, became something it had perhaps always had the structure for but not the sufficient inhabitants. It became a home in the fullest sense of the word. The months that followed were as busy as any Rebecca had been through, busier, because a baby in a ranch house adds a quantity of work that is significant and joyful in equal measure, and Rebecca found both the joy and the work to be entirely worth it. Thomas was a good-natured boy in the daytime and opinionated at night, which was a combination she managed with the same practical efficiency she brought to all challenges on the ranch. Walter was an extraordinary father. She had known he would be, had seen it in the way he was with the animals, with the careful, quiet tending of things, but seeing it in practice was something else. He came home from the day's work and picked up Thomas with a naturalness that looked like something he had been doing forever, carrying the boy against his shoulder while he moved about the house in the evenings, showing him things, the fire, the lamp, the patterns the light made on the ceiling, with the patient attention of a man who believed that everything deserved to be fully noticed. Thomas, for his part, regarded his father with the solemn concentration of a person taking careful notes. That first year with Thomas at the ranch, Walter spoke more than he had in the entire 2 years of his silence, and the year before that combined. He spoke to the baby with a quiet, steady stream of observations about the world. Here is the sky, here is the horse, here is the dog, here is your mother doing something impressive at the kitchen counter. And he spoke to Rebecca with an increasing ease and warmth that still had his particular quality of economy, but had lost almost entirely the sense of distance that had once lived in it. He still had hard days. She knew this. She could see them in the way he went very quiet sometimes, or went out at night to walk the pasture alone, and she let him have those without question because they were his and he was entitled to them, and because she trusted that he always came back. He always came back to the kitchen and to the fire and to her, and she was always there. In the fall of 1885, Denny, who was 17 now and a fixture of the ranch, almost as constant as Biscuit, told Rebecca that there was word going around Harlan of trouble up near the northern range. A group of land speculators out of Fort Worth were making moves on several small holdings in the county, using questionable legal maneuvering and in some cases outright pressure to acquire land. Two of the small ranchers north of Harlan had already sold under what people described as uncomfortable circumstances, and the concern was that the pressure would move south. Walter heard this from Denny too, and he and Rebecca talked about it that evening at the table with a seriousness appropriate to the subject. They were not wealthy people. The ranch was profitable enough to sustain itself and them, and to set aside a modest amount each year, and the land was theirs legally and clearly. Walter had the deed in the strong box under the floorboard of his room, and it was clean. But clean deeds and legal standing were not always sufficient against people with money and motivation. Walter went into Harlan the following week and had a conversation with the county land office, and with the judge who held the court for Harlan County, a principled man named Judge Erasmus Bell, who was known to be scrupulously fair, and who had no patience for land grabs of any kind. The judge told Walter that his deed was solid, and that anyone who came at the Calloway land through legal channels would find those channels thoroughly blocked. He also told Walter that the situation further north was an injustice plain and simple, and that some of the smaller homesteaders there had been Mexican-American families who had settled the land before even the current Texas legal frameworks had been clearly applied, and that those families had the least protection and were suffering most. Walter came home from this conversation with a specific gravity in his face that Rebecca recognized as the bearing of someone who has been told something true and is sitting with the weight of it. He said, "It is not a fair world out there for people who don't have the right papers or the right background. Bell is doing what he can, but there are limits to what the law can cover when money gets into it." Rebecca said, "What can we do?" Walter said, "We can make sure our own ground is solid, and we can be the kind of people who say the right things when it matters." He paused. "It's not enough, but it's what we've got tonight." She agreed, and they both knew it was the honest truth, and they did what they could within their means, including allowing one displaced family, the Garcias, whose small homestead to the north had been pressed into sale, to camp on the Calloway property for 2 months, while they made arrangements to move to relatives in San Antonio. Rebecca fed them, and Walter gave the father, Luis Garcia, work on the ranch through those months, and when they left with enough in wages to make the journey with dignity. It was a small thing in the face of a large injustice, and they both knew it, and they did it anyway. The years moved forward. Thomas grew from a quiet and observant infant into a bright and enthusiastic boy, possessed of his father's gray eyes and his mother's sharp intelligence, and a laugh, loud and unreserved, that had no precedent in either of them, and seemed to be entirely his own. He followed Walter around the ranch from the moment he could walk, which was early, and Walter showed him everything with the same careful, full attention he gave all things, and Thomas absorbed it with a dedication that was both moving and occasionally exhausting, because he also asked a great deal of questions. Walter answered every one. Rebecca watched this and found it one of the most satisfying things she had ever witnessed. This quiet man who had not spoken for 2 years, sitting on the corral fence with his 4-year-old son, patiently explaining the temperament of horses in measured sentences, while the boy asked follow-up questions with the tenacity of a very small journalist. In the fall of 1887, they discovered they were expecting a second child. This one arrived in April of 1888, another spring baby, a girl this time. She was born with Rebecca's chestnut hair and a temperament that announced itself immediately as strong-willed and specific, and they named her Clara. Walter had suggested it quietly one evening in Rebecca's 7th month, sitting beside her on the porch in the warm spring evening. He had said it carefully, watching her face, offering it as a possibility rather than a plan. He said, "I would like to name her Clara if she is a girl, if you think that is right and not too complicated." Rebecca thought about it. She thought about the blue porch railing, and the laugh that could be heard from the barn, and the man who had been built back into himself by grief and then by love and who had enough room in his heart to hold both. She said, "I think it is exactly right." Clara Calloway was born in April, as promised, loud and entirely sure of herself, and she was named with love that had both a past and a present in it. And she grew up on the Calloway ranch with her brother Thomas and her father and her mother and Biscuit's successor, a younger dog named Biscuit II, who was just as earnest and considerably more chaotic. The ranch grew in those years, modestly but steadily. Walter expanded the herd and built a second barn with help from Denny, who had grown into a capable young man and worked full-time for the Calloway ranch by the time he was 20, and from 2 other men from Harlan. Rebecca's garden had expanded to the point where they sold excess vegetables in town, and she had added a few fruit trees along the south fence that were beginning, in their patient way, to come into production. She kept accounts with the same precision she had brought to the original ledger on her first day, and the household ran with an efficiency that was never austere. She had decided very early that their home would be comfortable and warm and full of good smells and small details that made it distinctly theirs, and she maintained this standard without fuss or drama, the way she maintained everything. One evening in the spring of 1890, when Thomas was 6 and Clara was 2, and the bluebonnets were out again along the creek bank, and the evening light was exactly the color it had been on the day Rebecca rode toward the Calloway ranch 3 days through the mesquite and red dust, Walter and Rebecca sat on the porch together after supper. The children were inside, Thomas with a book and Clara asleep in her crib with the painted headboard. Biscuit II was in the yard. The frogs were starting their nightly conversation along the creek. The last of the light was going from the western sky in slow gradients of copper and gold. Walter had his arm around her on the porch bench, and she was leaning against him, and they were quiet in the way of people who have been quiet together for a long time and find in it not absence but presence. She said, "Do you remember the first night, when I knocked on the door?" He was quiet for a moment thinking. He said, "I remember everything about it." She said, "I was terrified. I had no idea what I was walking into." He said, "Neither did I." She looked up at him. He was looking at the sky at the last of the light, and the lines of his face were familiar to her now in the way that only years of close living make a face familiar. She knew every particular of it, the old scar, the way his jaw set when he was thinking hard, the fine lines at the corners of those gray eyes, which were more numerous now and which she found entirely beautiful. He looked down at her and she said, "I am very glad I knocked." He said, "I am very glad I opened the door." She said, "You opened it like you had been waiting." He considered this for a moment seriously, the way he considered all things. He said, "I think part of me must have been. Some part that knew something was coming, even when it didn't know what." He paused. "I had been very quiet for a long time and I had gotten used to it. And then you knocked and I opened the door and the quiet changed into something different. It was still quiet, but it wasn't empty anymore." Rebecca pressed her hand flat against his chest, over his heart, the way she had done countless times in the years of this life they had built together, and felt the steady, unhurried beat of it. She said, "I came here because I had nothing left. I had been erased in the town I grew up in and I had no one left and I had to begin again somewhere. I thought this was a practical arrangement." She smiled. "I had no idea." He put his hand over hers against his chest. He said, "It turned into something else." She said, "It turned into everything." He held her hand against his heart and did not say anything else for a while, but she felt him breathe, steady and slow, and the night came on fully around them, and the stars appeared over the Texas plain in their ancient numbers, the same stars under which people had loved and built and lost and found each other since before there were names for any of it. In the house behind them, Thomas turned a page. Clara made a small sound in her sleep. Biscuit the Second sat at the yard gate and looked alertly at the dark pasture, performing his duties with dedication. Walter Calloway pressed a kiss to the top of Rebecca's head, slow and certain, the same way he did everything, and she closed her eyes and let herself be entirely where she was. The Calloway ranch settled into the night. The fire inside was banked but still warm. The cedar box on the bedroom shelf held its small pencil. The journal on the kitchen table, the second one, and then the third and now the fourth, held all their words. The painted crib now held Clara, who had outgrown it slightly but still preferred it. The porch railing was still blue under its layers of weather. The land stretched away in every direction under the stars, and it was theirs built and tended and loved into something that would outlast them, already doing so in the dark-haired, gray-eyed boy who was reading himself toward sleep with his father's serious attention, and in the small girl with chestnut hair who dreamed whatever it is that 2-year-olds dream, full of certainty about the world she had been born into. This was what remained of silence and grief and 3 days of riding across red Texas dirt on faith. This was what became of a door opened at the right moment by the right hands. This was what the quiet had been waiting to become. In the years that followed, the Calloway Ranch would see more seasons of calves and harvests, and hard winters and brilliant springs. And Thomas would grow into a long-limbed and thoughtful boy, and then a young man who knew horses the way his father did, with a language of patience and presence. Clara would grow into a determined and argumentative and wholly delightful person who would exasperate her parents with great love on both sides. There would be hard years, because there always were, a drought in 1893 that tested the herd and the patience of everyone in Harlan County, a year when the cattle prices dropped and the accounts ran thin. There would be a winter when Walter was ill for 3 weeks, and Rebecca ran the entire ranch herself and discovered, without great surprise, that she could, and she did. There would be mornings when she came out to find him on the porch with his coffee and his hat, and Biscuit the Second at his feet, looking east over the pasture with that particular expression, the one that had started as grief and had become, over the years, something more complex and more whole, the face of a man who has learned to carry his losses without being crushed by them, who keeps them in the same heart as his joys because that is the only place there is to put them. On those mornings she would bring her own coffee out and sit beside him, and they would be quiet together in the way of people who have found the most valuable kind of peace, not the absence of things, but the presence of the right things, tended carefully over time. Thomas Calloway would eventually ride west when he was 19, which was 1903, drawn by a curiosity about the world beyond Harlan County that Rebecca recognized with a start as the same curiosity that had put her on a horse 3 days from Millhaven 20 years before. He left with his parents' blessing and his father's old good hat, which Walter placed on his head without ceremony, and with everything he had to say visible in those gray eyes. And Thomas rode west into a world that was changing fast, a world of railroads and wire fences and towns growing faster than the land could hold them, a world that was still wild in places and tame in others, and he would write letters that came slowly but came, and the ranch would hold his room for him. And eventually he would come back, older and altered and full of stories, with a young woman beside him who had the look of someone who had made a deliberate choice and knew it, and Walter and Rebecca would open their door to them both without hesitation. Clara would stay closer, though not without having her say about it, and would eventually marry a quiet and good-natured schoolteacher from Harlan named Edward Marsh, who built a house on the eastern edge of the Calloway land and ran a small school for the children of the area. And on Sunday afternoons, he and Walter would sit on the porch and conduct extremely measured conversations about extremely various topics. And Rebecca would sit beside Clara in the kitchen, and they would drink coffee and laugh at whatever they felt like laughing at, which was a great deal. The cedar box on the shelf never moved. The pencil inside it, small and blunt from its brief original use, remained exactly where it was. The blue ribbon was replaced twice over the years when the original wore through, but there was always a blue ribbon on the shelf beside the cedar box, because some things are worth maintaining as constants. The journal from the first year, the one with the brown cloth cover that was now soft as cloth from being handled, was kept in the cedar box alongside the pencil. Rebecca had written a date inside the front cover, the day she had arrived at the ranch, and below it, in Walter's handwriting, a single line added years later. She knocked and I opened the door. And below that, in her own hand, and everything began. It was enough. It was more than enough. It was the whole of it, the silence broken by a knock, the door opened by hands that had forgotten what opening was for, the two people who stood on either side of the threshold and chose, each of them, to step toward each other rather than away. Two people who had each been erased in their own way, and who had found, in the doing of ordinary life together, in the coffee made strong, and the fence posts mended, and the rain-soaked mornings on rooftops, and the evenings by the fire, and the children, and the seasons, and the years, a completeness that neither had imagined still existed in the world for them. Walter Calloway, who had not spoken to a soul in 2 years, who had made of silence a dwelling and of grief a discipline, who had stood in his doorway with the whole weight of loss behind him, and opened the door anyway. Rebecca Hayes, who had ridden 3 days on faith through the red dust of Texas, who had knocked without knowing what she was knocking toward, who had walked into the quiet of this man's life and found in it not emptiness but depth. The ranch grew old around them beautifully, the way well-tended things do. The cedar house weathered into a deeper, richer color. The garden spread and the fruit trees grew tall and generous. The herd moved with the seasons across the land, and the land held them all, the living and the remembered, with the particular grace of a place that knows what it has been trusted with. And on evenings when the sky above the Calloway ranch was the color of a bruise healing, purple and gold and still tender at the edges, you could find them on the porch the way you always could, sitting close together in the long light, their hands loosely joined between them. The two of them settled into each other the way rivers settle into their banks, not still, but belonging, moved by the same current, following the same course, going together toward whatever was next.